faculty here, and this is the second day of the two-day Foster-Foreman Conference of Distinguished Writers. We've had more than 40 of these over the years, not over 40 years, because we used to do it twice a year. But I've probably been to more than 30. And so the only ones I've missed, I think, were when I was on sabbatical. Otherwise, I have a good attendance record at these things, and they're always a treat. Purpose, of course, is primarily to expose journalism students to great reporting and great writing, and hope that you all will be inspired to make your own mark in the journalism world. So last night we had Anna Wolf from Mississippi Today. She's sitting right here. If you weren't here, I mean, she pretty much gave a clinic in exposing corruption in high places. I mean, it was really pretty great. So thanks for that last night. And tonight we have Lyndsay Green. First and foremost, she's an alum. She graduated from Penn State class of 2010. She says she was in a class of mine. I was like, I wish I could say I remember you, but I'm not actually sure I do. And she is a restaurant critic and food writer for the Detroit Free Press. She was a 2023 Pulitzer Prize finalist in criticism. And she has an essay in the latest edition of Best American Food Writing and has written for Ebony Magazine and for Teen Vogue. So if you've been to these before, you know the drill. First, the speaker will speak. She'll come up here to the podium, and then we'll sit over here and she will take some questions from me, but more importantly, we hope that she will take questions from you. So please welcome Lyndsay Green back to Penn State.
Hi, everybody. Got a little presentation here, so let's see if this. Hi, everyone. Thank you again. Thank you to everyone for having me here. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Walter, who's in the back. Thank you so much just for being such a great host, for inviting me. The Detroit connection is so appreciated. And I'm so happy to be back here at Penn State. It really is wild to be here. I've been here for a few days now, and walking around campus is just, it's so full circle, but it feels like I never left. So yeah, just really happy to be here. I'm gonna kind of walk around a little bit. I just kind of like to move, if that's okay with you guys. Okay, so what I wanted to focus the conversation on today, on criticism. So my role, still too close. My role is I'm the dining and restaurant critic at the Detroit Free Press. And so I wanted to really talk about what that looks like and kind of why it's important. I think my job is probably one of the most, maybe I shouldn't do this, too close, okay. My job, I think, is one of the most, sorry, maybe I should stay at the podium. People have a lot of questions about criticism, right? It's a job that is a really fun job. It's something where I think it's a dream job for a lot of people. I get paid to eat. That's the reality of it. So it is a lot of fun, but I get lots of questions about it all the time. You know, what is the process of a restaurant critic? Do you have to be anonymous? There's a lot of mystique, I guess, about the restaurant critic, right? So I wanted to just focus on criticism, but also not just for a restaurant critic, but I wanted to talk about criticism sort of just in general. So up here, these are just a few articles that came out years ago. This is back in 2010, and I think I have one from 2011. And these are just headlines that kind of talk about, you know, it kind of questions whether a critic is something that we should even, a position that we should still have. You know, I think with the rise of technology and social media and the internet, you know, we don't necessarily need critics anymore. Everyone is a critic. You can go online and you can see, you know, Yelp reviews, you've got bloggers, you've got influencers, you have a lot of people sharing opinions about the places that they go to eat, and feedback on the restaurants. And so it's been really questioned whether we should be dishing out all of this money for restaurant critics and people like me in my position. So again, that was back in 2010. And so, what is that now? Where are we? 13 years ago? And here's where I was in 2010. I just graduated from Penn State. I was really excited to get my degree. I was a print journalism student, so I graduated with a major in journalism. I double majored in international studies. I did a study abroad program in Madrid. And so when I got back, I really fell in love with just travel and culture, and decided to tack on the international studies major. And so my trajectory was a little bit different. I didn't think that I was going to be a restaurant critic. All of that was sort of happening in the background, the conversations about whether a critic is, you know, necessary or important. But for me, I actually had a different vision. So I'd always been in love with magazines. I'd always been in love with fashion and beauty, and being from New York, I was really excited to graduate and get back to New York and really pursue a career in magazine journalism. And so that's what I did. My first job was at Ebony magazine. For anybody in here who is a fan of fashion or beauty or magazines in any capacity, you might know Elaine Welteroth. And so she was my editor. I was her assistant at Ebony magazine. Elaine now is a New York Times bestseller. She's an author. She's a host on Project Runway. She, what else does she do? She hosts a show on Hulu right now called The Conversation Project, which also has a food tag, which is kind of cool. But I worked side by side with her and had a really great experience there in the beauty and fashion department. And so from there, I went to Glamour. Glamour launched a digital, or it wasn't digital at the time, but a quarterly beauty magazine called Glam Belleza Latina, which was basically a beauty magazine, a quarterly beauty magazine, published out of Glamour's beauty department. And so I was the assistant editor there, covered beauty for sort of a Latin audience. And then from there, I went to Teen Vogue. At Teen Vogue, I was the digital beauty editor, covering all kinds of things from celebrity news. Really, breaking news there was like Demi Lovato got a new tattoo. Just fun stuff. So that was sort of my trajectory. I really was in this beauty and fashion space. And my goal at the time really was to become the beauty director of a travel magazine. Again, I had that study abroad experience when I was here at Penn State, and I wanted to sort of merge these passions for beauty and fashion and sort of women's lifestyle, and my love for magazines, and kind of my new interest in international issues, travel, culture, all of that. And so eventually my husband and I, we moved to Chicago, and I started my own digital beauty magazine. It was called Beauty Atlas. And the idea was to sort of travel the world and discover their beauty cultures. I traveled to Havana, Cuba, and kind of explored their beauty scene there, which was really great. I went to Bali and sort of navigated their beauty scene there. And I did it all for Beauty Atlas. I worked for myself from home. And eventually I just kind of saw the challenges of being an entrepreneur. It's a lot harder to write words and then also try to monetize it. So I'm flashing back just to more headlines, right? So fast forward, and we're still having this conversation about restaurant critics and criticism in general and whether it's necessary. Again, you have TikTok, you've got Yelp, you have Google, and you just have the question of whether this is a position that really is worth it, right? If it's actually valuable. And so again, I wasn't quite on this path just yet, but what I do remember from my time in beauty is that, and even when I had my own magazine, what I remember is that for me, food was always like top of mind. That's really where my head was always at. I would travel to all of these different places, and the first thing I would look for was the best restaurant, or I was looking for the coolest bars to check out, or coffee shops to do work in. And so, I'd go to these coffee shops and I'd be doing work on these beauty stories, but really what was for me was being in these sort of food spaces. And I love it. When I think back to, being a beauty editor, there are a lot of perks. I'd get beauty products sent to me all the time. I would get sent to all of these really wonderful places. My job took me to Barcelona and Turks and Caicos and met Beyonce. I went to, concerts, did a lot of really cool things. But for me, what's the most memorable are the dishes that I ate, truly. Like, I can't really remember what the press trip was that I was on or what the brand, was promoting, but I do remember like this really amazing sushi that I had. Or I remember the first time that I went to an event. It was my very first event in New York City, and it was at Nobu, which I'm sure many of you have heard of by now. And I remember the dish, but I can't tell you what the brand was that took me there. So for me, this is all just sort of hindsight, but for me, food was really sort of natural for me. And so those conversations are happening, still questioning whether restaurant criticism is worth it, or criticism in general. And one thing I wanted to kind of point out too is that when I was working as a beauty editor, it wasn't really encouraged to write stories about yourself. I'm sure you guys who are journalism students, you probably have had the same conversations with professors and maybe internships, your bosses, things like that. But journalism, from what we're taught, is that it's not about you, right? It's all about reporting the stories. It's all about the news. It's all about the audience that you're sort of serving. It's never about me. And so that's kind of what I was trained up on. That's what I was raised on as a beauty editor. Maybe one-off, there might be a personal story here and there if it fit, but really that wasn't my experience. And so I remember, I just wanted to tell a story. So there was, being on the beauty scene, I would kind of, again, had a lot of really cool experiences, had a lot of fun things to do. I do Fashion Week every year, and at Fashion Week, I'd go backstage, and again, there'd be celebrities back there, and models, and designers, and the whole thing. And so I remember I'd go backstage, and I'd be by myself, and as a sort of a newcomer to the scene, I didn't really know anybody, but I did know that relationships were really important. And what I always saw in the editors that I worked with, or seasoned editors, is that they'd get there and they'd be buddied up with a publicist who would let them write in, or another editor they'd see, and they'd go in, and it just was a really comfortable setting. And I hadn't made it to that point. And so I remember I went backstage once, and I got to the station where you check in, and I said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so." And she said, "Okay." She had her clipboard in front of her, and she said, "Okay, and who are you with?" And I said the outlet that I was with, and she's, "Oh, okay, great, oh, it's so good to meet you." And it felt like this was gonna be my friend. It felt like, okay, I finally made a connection with someone. She seemed really warm and really open, and walked me right back, and I was like, all right, good. Next time I come, I'm gonna go straight to this woman, and I'm gonna say, "Hey girl, like, I'm back, let me in." So I went the next day, and I showed up, and the same PR person was at the door, and I got up. I think we might have even exchanged numbers the day before. But I got up there and I was so ready and I was like, hey, I'm back. And she looked at her clipboard and was like, who are you with? I was like, really? Like, is this, really, you don't remember me? Like, here I am feeling like I made a friend, I had a connection, and she just was doing her job and was like, girl, where are you from? And I remember that situation because it happened over and over and over again. It wasn't just Fashion Week, but a lot of experiences that I had, I would have that same moment of having to reintroduce myself to someone who I thought I already at least was familiar with. And so I had an informational interview with an editor that I had worked with briefly at People's Style Watch, which was People Magazine's fashion magazine. It's no longer. But I sat down and just got coffee with her, and we kind of just were talking, and I explained to her, or it might have just come up in conversation, that that experience that happened. And she said, that's a story. That's a story that you should tell. Have you thought about pitching that to someone? And I remember just thinking, like, no, why would I tell that story to anyone? Why would anyone care about that? Again, thinking about my sort of rearings in journalism, about it not being about me, I would think that any sort of essay or first person story, to me, I thought that was reserved for celebrities or tastemakers or notables, or even just people who had lived longer, like who just had more lived experiences. Here I am, 20-something, just started. Why would anybody want to read that story? And so totally shied away from it and said, nobody cares. So I just wanted to tell you that background story, just because, again, it just was never top of mind for me to ever infuse myself into any stories. It's just not what I did. And so fast forward, here I am. I started as the restaurant critic. I guess I should tell you a little bit about my journey into food. So it was kind of a harsh left. I really only started officially as a critic in January of 2020. So my husband and I, like I said, we moved to Chicago. I did some freelancing, started Beauty Atlas from there. Eventually we moved to Detroit, which is where my husband is from, and decided to just kind of move forward in that city. And so when we moved there, one thing that was really important to me was that I get a job. Again, being a freelancer, starting my own business, working from home, I realized that I just didn't have a community in Chicago, and that was tough. And so anyway, I started a job in Detroit. It was called, the publication is called Our Detroit. It's the Detroit area's monthly magazine. And so again, it was comfortable for me because I had this magazine experience and I just was sort of transferring it over into a new market. I started as their managing editor. 2 months into my role, our editor decided to retire. And so I was slid into the interim editor position, which I did for about 1.5 years. At the same time, our restaurant critic retired. And so while I was the editor, I was sort of trying to find a food writer to replace our critic, and just wasn't really finding the right fit. So I said, you know what, right now I'm just editing stories, I'm assigning stories. I think I can handle just writing 1 review a month. So I took on the restaurant reviews and I really found that I liked it. And again, that's a space, when you're writing a restaurant review, that's a space where you can sort of infuse your voice into your writing, right? It's a place where I can say, I walked into this room and I had this really great meal and I had, this experience, this is what I saw, this is what we talked about at the table. And as I started to do more and more of that, I really started to appreciate sort of just that style of writing. But eventually, again, I was in the position for about 1.5 years. I was burnt out. And so I just said, I think now that they have a new editor, I think it's time for me to figure out sort of what is my next move. And so I had no plans, I had no job lined up, I didn't know what I was gonna do, but I walked into the editor's office and I gave my notice. And surprisingly, he responded and said, we'd love to keep you on board in whatever capacity you'd like. And so he gave me the flexibility to kind of create my own role. And so eventually what we did is we created this position of dining editor. And it's not a position that the magazine ever had. Again, they had a restaurant critic, but that was just one review a month. And so this position, food was a huge beat for the magazine. There was a lot of food coverage that people really loved from the magazine. And so they didn't have one dedicated person who was responsible for all of the food coverage. And so I sort of raised my hand to do that and said, I will take care of the entire food section. I will write stories, I will edit them, I will handle the restaurant review. You won't have to think about food or assigning freelancers at all, that'll be me. And so that's the deal that we sort of struck. And that's how I got into kind of the food space. And again, that was January 2020. I got a head start on what work from home was like. I was able to do the job totally remote, a little bit ahead of everybody else. And then what was really nice about, there were a lot of challenges of the pandemic, obviously. I was impacted by it in a lot of ways, lost people, I definitely can see the damage that was done. But what I do also recognize as sort of a silver lining for me as a writer and as a food writer, a new food writer, was that I really got to sort of know restaurateurs and get to know food business owners and their real struggles and the struggles of the hospitality industry and sort of the cracks that are in the restaurant kind of system. And I was able to do that because I was able to have really honest conversations with these business owners. Typically, again, we talk about anonymity, where restaurant critics go into the restaurant and they're not supposed to be seen and you're not supposed to even know what they look like. And so this sort of really flipped that on its head, where it really was having FaceTime with these restaurant owners and really getting to know them pretty intimately. And so I did that job for almost 2 years, and then in 2021, I was named the restaurant critic at the Free Press. And one thing I do also want to mention about how I got to the Free Press, I had met the former restaurant critic at the Free Press once. I met him in passing at an event, and we kept promising to go to lunch or reconnect at some point, which we didn't. And one day I got an Instagram message from him, and he said he's getting ready to announce that he was taking a buyout at the Free Press. And he said, I hope it's not too presumptuous of me, but I've been following your work, and I think that you could be great for this position. So I put your name in the hat, and our editors are going to reach out if you're okay with that. And so, again, I'm not somebody who, says it's all about me. Again, just thinking about the way that I was raised in this industry, it had never been about me. And I thought what was really special about the way that this job sort of came into fruition was that it was about me. It was about my writing. It was about my voice that he had heard, not in person, but on paper. I found that to be really rewarding, especially as a writer, when you really don't know what people think. You kind of just put your work out there and kind of hope for the best. So for me, it was really nice to say, wow, I'm being recognized for my stories and my voice, and that felt really nice. So I just wanted to call attention to some of the stories that sort of made a little bit of a splash in that first year as a restaurant critic. The first one is a review of a Salvadoran restaurant in Detroit. They had been there for over 15 years and had never been reviewed. They'd never been covered. I think maybe the Spanish language press had covered them once, but other than that, on a large scale, nobody had ever covered them. And it was one of those places that I wasn't familiar with. I just drove by and saw this red awning and just was kind of like, what is that? And walked in and saw that it's a Salvadoran restaurant and market. And so they've got groceries, they've got sort of medicines, they've got all kinds of things for sort of the Central American community, which isn't huge in Detroit. We have a big Mexican population, but not a big Central American population. And so I did that review, and that's something that got a lot of attention because it kind of made people go, that place has been there for 15 years and we'd never heard of it. And so that was one. And then that story that I kind of mentioned earlier, that story about not feeling seen. After being in my role at the Free Press for a year, that same situation happened over and over and over again. I'd go into a restaurant, my title is dining and restaurant critic. And so part of my job is that I have a lot of face time with these restaurant owners. We have a top 10 takeover series, which means that we're bringing our readers into these restaurants and getting them to experience a tasting menu there, and I'm giving the chef an award, and I've interviewed them at least 3 times before the story has been released. And so I have a lot of interaction with these chefs. But what I noticed is that even, after I hand off the award, after I've done all of the interviews, if I go into their space just as me without an award in hand, they had no idea who I was. And what was interesting about it is that I would think of myself as sort of recognizable, right? I have big curly hair, I'm a Black woman, I'm pretty short in height. Like, there were a lot of these descriptors that you would think would sort of stand out to them. But again and again and again, they just would not remember me, and they'd reintroduce themselves, and it just was awkward every time. And so I wrote about that experience finally, and it wasn't because I thought that I was important enough, but I think I do have a responsibility as a Black restaurant critic, as far as I know, potentially the first Black female restaurant critic at a major newspaper, and the only right now. It is my responsibility to sort of look at why things are happening to me, and talk about it, talk about these observations that I'm making. And I think with that extra layer of the restaurant critic traditionally being anonymous, right? I don't have to be anonymous because my role is a split role, but somehow I still am. So I wrote that story, and that was another big headline. And then I wrote about Detroit's, the diversity or lack of diversity on Detroit's dining scene. And so again, being a Black woman, I'd go out to eat as my job. And what was really striking to me was that I'd go into these spaces, and outside, Detroit is predominantly Black. I think we've dropped a little bit, but I think we're still at around 78% or something like that, 78% Black. And so outside, I'm seeing these Black street ministers, and I'm seeing these Black barbecuers, and I'm seeing Black women up and down the street. And then I go into these restaurants, and I'm the only Black person in the room, or my husband and I make 2. And so I really kind of started noticing that that little stat, and started to question why that was, and kind of gave some tips potentially for restaurateurs to consider what they would need to do to diversify their spaces, make the few Black people who are in their spaces feel maybe a little bit more comfortable or a little bit more welcomed, and also what they could do to sort of create more inclusive spaces. And so those are 3 of the stories that really kind of got a lot of attention last year. And then of course this happened. I did not anticipate the Pulitzer in any way. My editors submitted my work, and so I really just didn't expect to be a finalist in any way. But I'm only including this because I want to just kind of show you guys that, yeah, there are conversations about how criticism is not valued, right? There are my own instincts that my voice isn't really, I don't know, it's not necessary to really share my perspective. But when something like this happens, it sort of just validates that there is value in criticism, and there is value in our unique voices. And I think what I included the links to the stories that we submitted for it, because each one of them had a common thread, and the thread was culture. I think that's even what they said up there, for rigorously reported coverage of restaurant openings and recommended dishes that also serve as an immersive cultural portrait of a vital American city. And so, any instinct that I might have had in the past of not talking about culture or not talking about myself or not talking about my own experiences, I think something like this couldn't have happened had I not done that. And then the last thing I just wanted to share is some feedback that I got from readers. I put up some notes here, but we talked about like all of these accolades on top of the Pulitzer, and I won a James Beard Award for Emerging Voice in Journalism. I was named a Future of Food 50 in Cherry Bomb magazine, which is a magazine that spotlights women in food and influential women in food. I've been covered by Eater. I've done a number of podcasts this year. So a lot of really exciting things and sort of accolades that I'm really humbled by. But I wanted to share this email. I don't know if you guys can read it from here, but this was an exchange that I had with a reader who had responded to my story on the lack of diversity in the dining scene. And she basically just questioned a lot of things in the story. And she said, I don't agree with your implication that, white owners shouldn't, or white owners aren't being inclusive in their spaces. And I don't want to read it word for word, but she had a lot of questions. And one thing that people always say is, did you know that Detroit was not predominantly Black at one point? And that's a kind of a phrase that gets tossed around a lot, especially when it comes to my writing. And it drives me a little crazy because it's like, yeah, but we're talking about right now. What we're talking about is right now in this moment. The city is nearly 80% Black, and there are no Black people in these restaurant spaces. And that's just something to observe and explore and see how we can sort of just welcome more people. And, we don't always get recommendations to respond to readers. That is not something that most editors suggest you do, because you'll drive yourself crazy. But I did respond to this woman. I felt like there was a window of opportunity for us to have a constructive conversation. And we did, and I explained to her exactly, what I just said, that we're talking about right now. And I told her that it was just an observation, and that I'm not suggesting that, the city should be full of only Black-owned businesses. And it was really nice for me because I felt like she received it. I felt like she really received my response and was able to walk away with maybe a new perspective. And so, again, thinking of my responsibility as the first, the only, I think these are the conversations that I have to continue to have, because even though this is small, right? This isn't, some huge metric that the Free Press will be able to use to sell the paper. To me, these small conversations and these small just sort of tweaks in kind of behavior and perspective can kind of change the world, in my opinion. And so that for me is really impactful. And again, it only happens when I share my personal stories and my personal experiences. I think that's my last. Yeah, that's my last slide. This is my cheesy just kind of end in just saying that I really think my whole point in saying all of this is that your voice really does matter. I wish I had learned maybe sooner that it's important to hone my own voice and share my own perspective, because I think that especially in this age where we're talking about AI and social media and all of these other voices threatening journalism and threatening this form of criticism, I think it matters. Like, our unique perspectives really do matter. And I guess I'll just kind of end it there.
Okay. Lyndsay and I actually have a lot in common because we're both from New York, and she writes about food and I eat food, so we're not eating each other. About the Q&A, I just want to say two things. One is, I really want to encourage you again to ask questions, because I always say about this is, if I want to ask Lyndsay questions, I can just call her up. And the other thing is, if you're assigned to write a story about this evening, it's often the case that some of the juiciest quotes and information comes out of the Q&A. So pay attention. So I'll ask a couple of questions to prime the pump. I want to get back to this question of anonymity. Could you explain to everybody who may not know why it's typically been considered important for a food critic to be anonymous, and why you haven't gone in for disguises yourself?
Yeah, so it's important just because you want to maintain an authentic dining experience. If everyone knows that the restaurant critic is in the room, then they're going to serve up their best dishes, and they're going to, be on their best behavior. Sometimes they'll even try to placate to the critic and offer, free drinks or free meals or, things that aren't even on the menu. And so it really just is to kind of maintain a true dining experience in the same way that the reader would have.
And another question I wanted to ask was, you had mentioned early on about Yelp and all these other sources of diner experience reviews. And so could you talk a little bit more about why the restaurant critic is still valued and necessary?
One of the things, so I spoke with a hospitality class earlier today, and one of the things that I mentioned is that there are lots of voices online. There's TikTok and there's Yelp and there are Google reviews and everything, but there's sort of an art to the craft. There are rules that we have to follow to make sure that we're delivering information in a credible way. So when I review a restaurant, I go at least 3 times. That's just sort of the baseline. For TikTokers and bloggers and these folks, one, you don't know their motivation, and a lot of times they're being paid by a brand or a restaurant or a marketing company to give a specific review, but also they're not following these same practices. So they're going to a restaurant maybe once, they might be coming from a completely different city, which I see a lot in Detroit. They'll come from, Philly or somewhere else and have one experience and base a negative review on that one experience. And we all saw during COVID that there are really tough times for restaurants right now, where it's a really tough time. And so if you're basing it off of one poor experience, that's, it's not really fair to the business. And so you see a lot of that. And so there are a lot of protocols that I follow. 3 times, like I said, is the baseline. I might, if I have a really terrible dish and I'm going to say, this was the worst dish I ever had, I have to be able to back that up. So that means I need to actually go to the restaurant more times now to try that same dish and make sure that it actually is the worst I've ever had and not just, a poor experience. So yeah, there's a lot more to it than just eating and writing.
And who pays?
So I pay, but I get reimbursed. So my employer technically pays.
Point being, you don't get free meals from
Exactly.
And I want to just read a quick excerpt from one of the columns and then ask you a question about it. She wrote, there's a sense that the place is playing a game of fine dining dress-up, something like a toddler awkwardly finding her footing in a pair of her mother's heels for the first time, which is really a lovely piece of writing. But I also wanted to ask, is it more fun to write a negative review than a positive?
No, it's painful. It's painful to write a negative review, and that's actually really one of the only negative reviews I've written. I have done some that are a little bit more textured and talk about the good and the bad. I think I can be a little bit more, I don't know, maybe a little bit more artful. Also, when I'm trying to be somewhat delicate in how I'm trying to critique them. But no, it's not more fun.
So we have 2 microphones. Questions from you all. Here comes somebody.
My name is Kate Orwell, and I'm a third show that received comments from minor academic studies. And I know that you talked about throughout your whole presentation, particularly was your experience of being not seen in the room, not being visible. And as a Black woman on this campus and in the college content can feel that way in a lot of different aspects. And speaking about how your voice matters in the work that you do, and outside of that, do you have any advice for students that are experiencing things like that on campus, and when you transition to the raising force?
That's a great question.
You want to just repeat the question?
Yeah, so she's asking, as a Black woman, you know, I talked about my experience feeling unseen, and in a lot of situations here on campus or elsewhere, as a Black woman, you have the same experience. And so her question is, what advice I have for someone sort of trying to navigate that. One thing I want to say first is that I'm not the first person to talk about this, and I don't want people to take comfort in the experience and say, oh, great, it's happening to her, so it's normal. I think one of the biggest things for me is observation, right? Once you notice it, then you can sort of figure out what your next steps are. So it sounds like you've already kind of noticed it. I think whatever it is that you are doing or want to do, whatever your goals are, I think if you could find a way to assert yourself there and make sure that you're seen, like I said, for me, and it wasn't necessarily on purpose, but when I sort of committed to being myself, speaking from my experiences and being honest about those experiences and not thinking about whether people would be okay with that, people started to see me, you know, and maybe it wasn't physically see me, but they saw me through my writing. And so for you as a broadcast journalist, you know, I don't know what you're looking to do, but whatever your craft is, I would say show yourself through there, you know, use your work to show up, you know, to be present. And I think if you ever find that people are fighting you on that, yeah, I think then you can be a little bit more vocal about why you're the person who knows better, you know, why you know a certain culture or an experience because you are, you know, just speaking from experience.
More questions, please.
This is a kind of a generational question. Do you run into, I mean, you are well-trained in your craft, do you run into that thing where people begin to question whether or not you have gone out of your lane and should be dealing with the barbecue joints or whatever? Or is that something that comes out of my generation?
So your question is if people are questioning sort of my like pedigree to be covering a certain type of restaurant, is that right? Okay. No, not so much. I don't get that, but I'll give you an example. That excerpt that you just read, I did get the, which is interesting, it ended up playing into another story, but the owner of that restaurant reached out. Obviously, she was not happy at all about that review. And her question was, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? What qualifications do you have to be critiquing restaurants? You know, where did you even come from that you are the person that is, you know, that has the right to critique us this harshly. And what was interesting was I, months before, had sat down with her and her husband and talked about all of their experiences in the restaurant industry. And when that story, I was at a different publication, but when that story was positive, she didn't question my qualifications, right? It didn't matter then because I was writing a positive review and I was talking about all of the wonderful things they've done, and that was okay. And so it wasn't until I, was covering her through a different lens that it suddenly was like, well, where does your degree in? That's the only time I can really say that someone sort of challenged my chops to do this job.
More questions, Rhonda?
What did you do to prep for a change from beauty and fashion to food and dining? How did you get to the point where you?
Nothing. It was an accident. A lot of things happen by accident. But I think something I did, there were a lot of notes that I was supposed to give in my presentation that got left on the cutting room floor. But one of the things that I think a lot of people experienced during these past couple years in the pandemic is that they really started to reevaluate where they were and what they were doing. And I was one of those people. And so for me, creating that position of dining editor was kind of the start, where it just was, this was right before COVID, but it was like, there was something inside of me that just said, like, it's time for a change. And I just really was stepping off of the cliff. I didn't have anything lined up and just decided to do it. And then it just so happened that dining seemed to be, the best fit. And so it flowed really nicely and I got into it really comfortably. But also during COVID, I started to think about, I started gardening and I really have developed a passion for urban agriculture, and I would love to have a farm someday. Like this is kind of where my head is at. And I'm really thinking about the food system from the start, starting from farming and working its way up to restaurants. So I think it's a pandemic change. It's that pandemic pivot that just happened.
So there's Philly cheesesteaks and Cincinnati chili. What's quintessentially Detroit?
The Coney. It's a Coney dog. It's interesting because it has New York roots, Coney Island in Brooklyn. But the Coney dog, it's a hot dog. It has chili mustard and onions on top, and every Coney kind of rivals of which is the best. It's a hot dog.
I'm curious, how many of you have posted reviews of restaurants on social media? And not very many. And how many of you think it would be cool to be a food writer? Many. I wrote down this phrase, I think it came from you, cultural exchange through culinary art. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. Could you expound on that idea? Yeah, part of what I'm thinking about is, I remember when Robin Gibbons, I think, won a Pulitzer for writing about fashion, and there's that tendency similarly to think that it's kind of relatively trivial in the world of news, just as maybe writing about food might be considered relatively trivial. But I think her argument is that fashion is this whole symbol system and expresses so much about culture. And I think you could certainly say the same thing about food.
Definitely, yeah. I get this feedback all the time from people who are not happy with my work is shut up and eat, right? It's kind of like the LeBron shut up and dribble, commentary, right? But again, what I've learned in this short amount of time that I've been doing this is that there's so much more to food. Food can be political. It is cultural. I see it being from New York, but also being based in Detroit. We have so many different cultures. One of the things that I talked about earlier today was that we see this non-alcoholic trend in restaurants now and bars. Restaurateurs are really starting to cater to folks who are not drinking. But we see that a lot in Detroit, and we've seen it for a long time because we have a huge Middle Eastern population. And so there's a whole swath of people that are patronizing these restaurants that don't drink. And so I said all that to say just that, when you think about food, culture plays into it just so much in so many different ways. I mean, even if you sit 10 people at a table and they all speak different languages, like you will always understand yum, right? Like that is universal. And we all have to eat. We all have to nourish our bodies in the same way.
You feel like you have power? I mean, in the sense of, like when you reviewed that Salvadoran restaurant, did you see like there was a spike in business, or if you write a negative review?
Yeah.
It was a negative.
Definitely. So that Salvadoran review was my first review. So at the top of the year, we name a restaurant of the year and the 10 best new restaurants. And so that was my very first project as restaurant critic. And after that, I saw how powerful that package was. I saw, how our restaurant of the year almost had to close. He was so overwhelmed by the amount of people that that showed up or that were calling that he almost couldn't handle it. Thank God they survived. But when I recognized that that was the power that I had, my very first review after that big package was the Salvadoran spot. And for a minute, I was so excited to tell that story. I actually couldn't wait to be done with the Restaurant of the Year package so I could get to that spot, because I thought people needed to know about it. But when I recognized how much power I had, I kind of had to pump the brakes a little bit. And I wanted to make sure in that review that I was really respectful, that that place really was intended for a specific community and a specific community's needs. And so I didn't want to just rave about it and say, everybody come check them out. Of course, I'm sure they would have appreciated the business to some respect, but I also wanted to make sure that the people who I saw that were coming into the restaurant in their school uniforms, the working moms that were coming in at 8 o'clock at night to have a late night meal with their family, that there's only 6 seats in the place. If they get pushed out, like that is not really my intention. So that light bulb went off pretty early, and I do treat things kind of delicately.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hey, so I'm a third-year student, and I just have a quick question. Whenever you talk about going to the Detroit restaurant scene, and you notice there aren't any other Black individuals, and it's mainly white, we get told a lot, kind of similarly to how we should remove ourselves from stories. We kind of need to pay attention to what's not there, just as much as we're paying attention to what is there. So do you have kind of any advice on how to kind of make sure that you're trying to put yourself in that situation of what is missing? Because I know that for myself as a white individual, I probably would have walked into that restaurant and not noticed.
Yeah.
So kind of where do you?
Well, what's really interesting to me was that a lot of the feedback that I got was, it was from a lot of Black people that were like, we've been talking about this forever. But also there were white people that were responding to it and saying, I never would say this out loud, but I noticed the same thing all the time. And I was always so curious about why that was happening. I was really surprised that people, particularly white people, were that observant, But the other side of it for the Black community that kept saying, we talk about this all the time. We talk about this all the time. I think that's what I would pay attention to. What do you talk about all the time in your circles that you don't talk about publicly? And think about how you can talk about that publicly. Because I think it's like you're trying to reach for something in an empty bag to, to see if there's a story. When really, when you go home tonight, there might be something that you talk about with your partner or your family or whoever, and it's just never left the four walls of your house. And I think that's what I was trying to communicate in my presentation. It's that these stories are so much closer than you realize. You don't always have to sit down and look around and say, okay, what am I noticing here? There are a lot of things that you notice all the time. You just don't realize that you can talk about it. You can talk about it publicly.
Gary, do you have one?
mentioned, things such as Yelp reviews, Google reviews, they're not going anywhere. They're going to be here. What do you see as the balance between the formalized nature of what you do and the informal and spontaneous and more accessible nature of those types of platforms?
That's a good question. Is there a bridge between the two? I don't know. Honestly, I'm not sure. I think that that's a tough question. I think that somehow, and I don't know if it's us, the restaurant critics, but I think there needs to be more conversation about why the critic is important. I think that we need to talk about it more. I think something I realized recently, when you look at TV, right? If you watch the Food Network or all of these shows are now just food competitions. And you always see the judges are chefs. They're chefs. They maybe were on the competition shows and they've become food personalities. They've become celebrities in their own right. Or again, it's largely just chefs. But what you don't see are restaurant critics, right? You don't see these people who are hired to critique food on a daily basis, but we are the people that give chefs their platform, right? Our positive reviews are what make celebrity chefs, what make Michelin star restaurants, what make James Beard Award winners. It really is because of us. And so if we went away, yeah, I guess that's the question, right? If we went, I mean, maybe that's actually not your question. Like, now I'm going on a tangent. But if we went away, who would be naming restaurants James Beard Award winners? TikTokers? How? You know, this is me genuinely just like thinking this through. I don't know what that bridge is. The only thing I can think is that we need advocates. And I don't know who those people are.
Follow up. If we were to go search, is there somewhere on the internet a Lyndsay Green Yelp review or a Google review sitting out there before you can who you are?
No, never. I wrote one review recently because they made me, and it was for an acupuncturist.
I have two very quick questions. Best restaurant meal you've ever had, and your desert island meal, like the one food if you had to only eat one thing.
I have to prepare for these kind of questions better. Favorite best meal, but it's not in a restaurant really. I love this dish called Foster-Foreman, which is basically it's like a Latin lasagna, and it layers sweet plantains with ground beef and cheese. It's just like, I love anything that's like sweet and savory. And so for me, that's like, I could eat a whole tray. What was the second? Desert island. Can I say the same thing? No, maybe plantains. I think sweet plantains, and you could give it any day, anytime. I'll eat it. Bacon also.
So last question, you kind of gave your advice here, but so to put this in a slightly different way, what do you wish you had known when you were sitting out there that you know now sitting here?
Yeah. I think it really is that. I think it is that my voice and my experiences were important at any stage of my life. I think we all have stories to tell that are interesting, even if they're just for a blog, even if they're just for myself. I wish I started journaling earlier, you know. Yeah, I think that was probably the biggest thing. I think also networking is huge. It's not necessarily journalism per se, but it is a career tip, and it plays into journalism, at least for me in my career. I know that every job I got through a former coworker or colleague or student here at Penn State even. So I think really maintaining relationships is so important, but also organically. Like, I think seeking out people in an organic way and not like a transactional way is also important.
Yeah, I see you want to ask a question. We are kind of out of time. Maybe you can ask privately after we finish. Anyway, Lyndsay, thanks for coming back to your alma mater.
Thank you.